Hello folks and welcome to this week. Coming your way on this episode, we will talk Renault, or should we say Alpine, and the Formula 1 team which finds itself in the midst of the much hyped Renaulution. We will talk Ferrari and McLaren and how their news stories this week are all sort of interlinked. We'll also, of course, talk about the Formula 1 calendar, which has been rejigged again. In fact, we'll talk about the calendars for a lot of racing championships around the world, which all sit in a state of flux as the global health crisis shows no sign of abating. We'll talk World Endurance Championship, we'll talk World Rally Championship, we'll throw in a bit of Formula E and a little bit of Dakar as well, all coming your way on This Week. Let's start then with what really was one of the biggest stories of the week, and it all revolves around this Renaulution that we talked about last week. And it began right at the start of the week with Cyril Abiteboul, who was supposed to be leaving the F1 team to take over the running of the Alpine brand. Instead, it was announced that not only would Cyril not be running Alpine, Cyril would be leaving Group Renault altogether. And that really is a shock, given that he spent the vast majority of his professional career over the last 20 years as part of the Renault family. But Cyril has gone. On Thursday, Luca Di Maio did indeed launch this Renaulution, which is based around a €500 million reduction in spending for the company. Each year, the loss of 1 million models in production every year, but it brings all of their sporting exploits under the Alpine brand. Laurent Rossi, who was formerly in business strategy for Renault, comes over and will run the Alpine brand. They launched a winter testing livery for the F1 car. Little bit bland. We're hoping for something a bit more blue, a bit more Alpine when the actual car livery is launched for the season. But critically, questions asked as to why nothing was announced over the team's management structure. We are still expecting Marcin Bukowski to be announced as the team principal and Davide Briviog to come in as something to do with sporting director, CEO, something in that capacity, whether it's just for the F1 team or for Alpine's racing activities as a whole, we're not so sure. But would have been the perfect opportunity to have announced that management structure. But as it is, the Alpine F1 team may have an interim livery, but as things stand, certainly in the public domain anyway, there is as yet no news over the team's management structure. Mercedes. And no, there is no news over Lewis Hamilton and his new contract. It is still being discussed, it is still being resolved, and I don't believe that there is really anything untoward with it. It'll get done, we just got to wait a couple more days until it is, or a couple more weeks, however long it takes. They're interesting. There have been some articles that have quoted Lewis and have quoted Toto, but as I understand it, nothing on the record's come from either of them. How could it? The deal's not been done. Toto did, however, go on the record this week speaking about the gargantuan task that stands in front of Mercedes and indeed really all of the top teams in Formula 1, because this is the year that the budget cap kicks into Formula 1, 145 million. That is the spending limit for all of the F1 teams this year. Particularly for a big team like Mercedes, it's going to be really difficult for them to pull down to that level, particularly when you look to the future and recognise that in 2022 we've got the new regulations coming in as well. So there's kind of a double spend for 2021. There were some stories throughout this week that perhaps the regulations would get delayed again from 2022 to 2023. However, I spoke to the gang at Formula 1 and they have assured me that the new regulations will come into force in 2022, come what may. Regardless of this global pandemic, the new regulations for Formula 1, that new start, that new future, will come into play in 2022. Now, Mercedes kind of actually linked to the team, although you might not expect it. A third of the team now owned by Ineos. Ineos have a team running and hoping to race for the America's Cup this year, and they actually won a couple of the opening kind of like prologue races last night. You might not think that has a lot to do with the Formula One team, and yet it actually does, because over the winter and before Christmas, the sailing team, had a couple of issues, had a couple of problems. And so they've been utilising some of the folks at Brackley who've actually been seconded out to help the America's Cup team, and already paying dividends because they won those 2 races last night. Essentially, they have to go through all these prologues in order to be the team that then competes with New Zealand for the America's Cup. And so far, that relationship, that collaboration with Brackley seems, fingers crossed, to be paying dividends. One more piece of news for Mercedes is that Valtteri Bottas today starts the Arctic Rally. It will be his 3rd time in the competition, where he finished 9th last year. Now to Ferrari and McLaren, who, as we said, have kind of interlinking stories this week. Unfortunately, Charles Leclerc has tested positive for COVID-19. He is in self-isolation in Monaco and has some mild symptoms, but is feeling okay and is just taking it easy. Had a few texts with him yesterday, and he's feeling all right. Lando Norris over at McLaren, meanwhile, is still under quarantine in Dubai. However, he comes out of quarantine early next week, Monday or Tuesday, I believe, and will stay in Dubai to take part in the training camp that he was always supposed to be taking part in, and was the reason why he was in Dubai in the first place. Now, Lando's former McLaren teammate Carlos Sainz is now a Ferrari driver. He was in Maranello this week, as expected, took a little bit of time out to go to Fiorano to give some words of advice and encouragement to the girls on track finalists who have been put through their paces all the way through this week in Italy. Can't wait to see what the result of that is. And the man who replaces Carlos at McLaren, Daniel Ricciardo, will be in Woking at the end of January. Now, a big difference between Carlos and Daniel is that Carlos is going to get, so I understand, a run in an old Ferrari before testing starts to get himself sort of acquainted with the team, the steering wheel, all that kind of stuff. Daniel won't have that luxury. Actually, neither will Sebastian Vettel over at Aston Martin. But McLaren have been sending Daniel a lot of homework to do in LA, including full radio recordings of races, so that he can listen in, see what he likes, see what he doesn't like, and give them some feedback on that. But as I said, Daniel will be in the UK. He will be at McLaren at the end of the month. Now, we'll finish off talking about Formula One this week, looking at Red Bull Racing and the fact that Red Bull apparently are getting closer to agreeing a deal with Honda to take over the IP of their engines and essentially manufacture them themselves. It would involve Red Bull Technologies taking over Honda's plant in Milton Keynes, and probably keeping on a number of their staff as well. That's yet to be confirmed, but it is much rumoured. It would, however, require a change in the current status quo in Formula One, and for an engine freeze to be initiated, and that is a long way from being agreed in Formula One. I must apologise for not mentioning last week that Alex Albon will be the team's reserve driver this year and will be very present for the team at Grand Prix, and also will be racing in the DTM on a part-time basis, teaming up with Liam Lawson and a Red Bull team. The thing with all this, though, is that the announcement's been made, but the specifics haven't really been detailed, and nobody seems to know exactly how it's all going to work out. He won't be driving a Honda. Rumours are he might be driving a Ferrari. Who would run that Ferrari, though, is somewhat in question. There doesn't seem to be anything concrete about exactly how Alex might go racing in the DTM. Red Bull, meanwhile, announced just this morning that they're placing pretty much all of their young drivers in either Formula 2 or Formula 3 this year. Oh, and while we're talking about DTM, they have had to cancel their original first round. Their new first round will be in Monza in June. And while we're talking about calendars, we must of course talk about the Formula One calendar, because just as we anticipated last week, Australia and China have both been delayed until later in the year. Australia will take a November date. China, though, might struggle to find a slot in the calendar because the rejigged calendar released during the week shows 11 races in 13 weeks over 4 continents in the second half of the season. I just don't know where they're going to be able to slot China in. Imola has taken the place of China in the early part of the season, and I understand that Portimao will be confirmed as a back-to-back with Spain in April. There was some consideration that April might become the summer break, and essentially August, the August break that normally we have in Formula One for the summer, would move to the early part of the season if indeed COVID and travel restrictions and the lockdowns remain as they are. But for now, at least, Imola will be the second race of the season after Bahrain. Pre-season testing in Bahrain will happen as well. That's been moved from Barcelona. That will now take place on the 12th to the 14th of March, so 10 days later than was originally scheduled. The calendar, though, remains very much in flux. It is very much still in the ether as to exactly what the Formula One calendar will look like for 2021. One good bit of news to keep you fed with racing action during these winter months. Formula One has announced that their Esports Championship will be back. At the moment, 3 rounds have been announced. Current drivers, former drivers, celebrities and esports racers will all be competing, with the money, big jackpot prize, all going to charity. Now, I did promise that I would try and answer some of your questions, and I got to thank you all for sending in your questions. Thank you all for your comments. I've read every single one. One of the questions that I really wanted to answer, let's start with something that could be a bit controversial. It's not, don't worry. Shyam Sundar asked, how much has Brexit affected the British-based Formula One teams? Well, the answer to that, thankfully, is not as much as it could have done. There was a massive fear, with only a week or so to go, that there would be a no-deal Brexit and things could get very sticky indeed. As it happened, there was a last-minute trade deal, and so while there is more red tape, there's more hurdles to be jumped over, the processes are longer and a bit more complicated, it's really not as bad as it could have been. That said, there are some uncertainties at the moment, certainly in terms of EU nationals working in the UK, UK nationals working in the EU, their needs for work permits, work visas, even for individuals who aren't living and working in those countries but are just going to those countries to work for races, because each individual EU nation has the right to create and impose their own stipulations for work permits and working visas. What's that you say? Sovereign nations within the EU have always had the right to determine their own immigration and border policy. From 2022, travellers are expected to need a European equivalent of the American ESTA. And the only other thing that could form a little bit of difficulty, well, an expense more than a difficulty, is the fact that with the UK leaving the EU's ban on roaming charges for mobile phones comes to an end as well. So all Brits going to Europe for work, for pleasure, whatever, may lose that right. Although, at the moment, the vast majority of UK network providers have said they will continue to maintain that roaming-free access within Europe. We also had a great question in from the Don Barracuda, who said that over the winter, he remembered the FIA making a statement that they had come up with a sustainable biofuel for use in Formula One. What's the latest on that? Well, the FIA have sent this fuel to all of the power unit manufacturers and are waiting their feedback. They should be getting it in a couple of weeks' time to have allowed the teams enough time to really sort of run through their paces with this and see where they're at. I don't think we'll see it online in the immediate future, but it's a fascinating advancement. It's a fascinating technology, something to be looked at, and certainly can't wait to hear back from the FIA on what the feedback has been from the power unit providers over that sustainable biofuel. Back to the news now, and the all-female W Series Championship will get back to racing ways in 2021, and they will begin with a 5-day test in Valencia as announced this week. The championship will support 8 Formula 1 Grand Prix throughout the 2021 season. Formula E now, and some big bits of news during the week. Firstly, the start of the third generation 2022-2023 will see its private testing time slashed from 13 days to 10 days. Another big bit of news during the week is the fact that McLaren have been granted an option to join the championship. With BMW and Audi departing, McLaren joining would be big news for Formula E, and they are weighing up that possibility for that same 2022-2023 season. While we're on the subject of McLaren, interesting comments out of Jenson Button in the week that he had been due to test in Indycar for McLaren in 2020 with an eye to competing on road and street courses for the team in 2021. Because of COVID, rejigged calendars, all of that, it never ended up happening. And that is just such a shame. When you think about the fact Jimmy Johnson was in his Ganassi this week doing a little bit of pre-season sort of shakedowns. Could you imagine Jimmy Johnson versus Jenson Button in what is already an incredibly strong IndyCar field? That would have been... oh man, that would have been something. But it's not totally off the table. The opportunity might still present itself, be it during 2021 or beyond, for Jenson, if he gets some testing time in a McLaren IndyCar, to possibly go and do IndyCar. And that, I think, would just be absolutely wonderful. While we're on the topic of IndyCar, worth relaying a bit of news that broke within the last 24 hours. Ryan Hunter-Reay is back with Andretti Autosport in the DHL number 28. So great to see Ryan Hunter-Reay back in what is a very strong field. That season, of course, kicking off in April. Now, we've already talked a little bit about calendars being shifted around because of the global pandemic. MotoGP is another championship that has seen a change in its calendar in this early part of the year. Malaysia has announced a state of emergency which may last in place until August. So because of that, the pre-season test at Sepang has been cancelled. In its place then, a couple more days of testing in Qatar before the opening round of the season. Now, we spoke earlier about the Arctic Rally that Valtteri Bottas is taking part in this weekend. But Arctic Rally Finland will be on the WRC calendar this year, replacing Rally Sweden as the championship's sole snow and ice rally, and it will take place in the Rally Sweden slot at the end of February, so that will be great. Rally Finland still exists, will still happen a little bit later in the season, August, I think, for Rally Finland. So 2 Finnish rallies this year, easy for me to say. In addition to that, some big WRC news is that Thierry Neuville, the defending race winner at the Monte Carlo rally, will be without his co-driver of a decade. Announced this morning, the duo have split. So that's a bit of an earthquake in the rally world. A potential earthquake also coming this weekend in Monte Carlo. Massive question marks over the event itself. The historic rally that normally takes place the week after has been cancelled by the French authorities. A lot of people worried about this weekend's rally in Monte Carlo because of travel restrictions that are in place, particularly British competitors, in terms of even getting out there. At the moment, the rally is on, due to be next week. But yeah, some big question marks over whether it will or will not happen. The all-new Extreme E Championship has delayed its first race of the season by a couple of weeks. It will now take place in April, with Formula E's first race itself happening at night in Saudi Arabia, and with the Dakar Rally happening at the moment. In fact, it's just finished in Saudi Arabia. It appears if you want to go racing early in the new year, Saudi Arabia is probably the place to do it. Talking of the Dakar, there are plans for a green bivouac as of 2020. 2020. Indeed, an alternative energy class for the championship will make its debut next year, with all cars and bikes running low emissions by 2026 and zero emissions by 2030. Today was the last day of the 2021 running. Last week's leader in the bikes, Toby Price, sadly crashing out, with both Brabham and Sunderland stopping to help him. They subsequently had their time returned to them for the time they lost in helping their rival, but it wasn't quite enough to help them take the victory. That went to Argentina's Kevin Benavides. In the cars, Stefan Petter Hansel took his 14th Dakar victory, 30 years after his first, which he took as a bike rider. He was the target man from the off, with Al Attiyah and Sainz completing the podium. Sadly, though, the Dakar remains a desperately treacherous race, and sadly, Pierre Chepin lost his life during the 2021 running. Dakar and the world of motorsport also mourning this week the loss of legendary driver Hubert Auriol, the first rider and racer to win on two wheels and four, and in later life a director of the race. And finally, let's look at the World Endurance Championship, because this morning Toyota unveiled the first official pictures of their all-new hypercar, the GR, which stands for Gazoo Racing 010. It's a beautiful thing, but sadly it will be the only hypercar entry for Sebring, which is the round that is due to start the 2021 season. Glickenhaus having already pulled their hypercar, which is a stunner in and of itself, out of the event. Indeed, there are some questions at the moment whether Sebring will even be the opening round of the World Endurance Championship season. Again, travel restrictions, travel blocks, people not knowing whether they can travel around the world to come to these races. It may be that the World Endurance Championship starts its 2021 season in Portimao. And that, folks, is pretty much that for this episode of This Week for January the 15th, 2021. Thank you all for your comments, for your questions. Keep them coming. And as I said, I will do my best to answer as many of them as I can every week. Hit that subscribe button and you'll be notified when the next episode is up, which should be just about this time next week for the next episode of This Week.